call for more money at the Capitol at a time when lawmakers tried to find a deal on a tight budget. Good morning and thank you for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Phil Prazen, filling in this week for Josh Hinkle. Lawmakers have a few short weeks to decide the next two-year budget, and battle lines are drawn over your neighborhood school. A man charged with setting education policy has an ominous warning. If his plan does not pass, property taxes skyrocket and schools close. Houston Republican Dan Huberty chairs the House Public Education Committee. His House Bill 21 would give more money to property-poor school districts and, in turn, let districts like Austin keep more of its tax dollars for its own schools. To make it happen, it would increase the amount of money the state spends per student. But many lawmakers find the $1.6 billion that comes with it simply too much of an expense to swallow. The stakes are high.
If we don't do this, local taxpayers will be forced to bear the burden of the reductions, and or they will have to go to their voters and increase taxes. And I don't think it's fair for us to sit here and say, well, you know, good for us, you know, we're coming up here and doing all these wonderful conservative things and going back home and not delivering it. I don't want to go home and say, I cut funding to education. You know, I had to do that in 2011. I am not going to do that again.
This all sets up the stage for the toughest debate at the Capitol to come. The Senate's budget does not include the $1.6 billion the House wants, and the most powerful man in the state, leader of the Texas Senate, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, might have already ended the deal earlier. He said there would be no school finance reform unless the House approves a school choice program with it. He, in fact, pushed the Senate to pass a measure to let families use tax dollars to pay for private or home schools. We told you last week how the House voted to reject that plan. But it's not only policy getting in the way. Texas simply has less money to spend. The state faces a $6 billion budget shortfall this session, and many want to get their hands on what's left. State employees across Texas marched on the Capitol calling for a raise and an end to the governor-imposed hiring freeze. Hundreds of people joined the rally along Congress Avenue carrying signs and wearing black shirts as a show of unity. The workers say their pay lags behind the cost of living in Texas. The Texas State Employees Union calls on lawmakers to dip into the state's rainy day fund while it sits at more than $10 billion. That's not likely to happen. Neither budget proposal already passed by the House or the Senate increases state employee pay over the next 2 years. And to make matters worse, state workers say when Governor Abbott imposed the hiring freeze, he also put too much of a load on the state employees we have.
For more than 20 years, Cora Bennett has had to be the adult in people's lives. As a case manager for the juvenile justice system, she helps young criminals come back into society.
I'm mom, dad, aunt, uncle, friend, confidant, teacher. You have to be able to communicate with the kid on a level to let them know that you're there for them and that you're not going anywhere.
She came to march on the state capitol and says low pay, around $35,000 a year, is driving people out. 1 out of 4 people quit every year in her office.
Job duties are passed down. If I have 14, 15, 16 kids, and all of a sudden now I have 20 or 30 kids, well, obviously, you're not going to be able to do the same job as you would with 15.
Here's how we got here. Last budget, we had money. More money than we ended up spending. Lawmakers gave Texans tax relief and dedicated money to Texas highways. And then the state didn't grow as much with a downturn in the oil industry. Now we're sitting in a $6 to $8 billion shortfall. To get through this, lawmakers want to tap the state's $10 billion savings account or delay paying the highway money.
We want children to be productive and able to go back into the community and not get in trouble and not come back into lockup.
And the stakes are high. Juvenile justice caseworkers try and make sure that Texans who committed crimes as children don't commit more crimes as adults.
And now we reached out to Governor Abbott's office to see when this hiring freeze would end. His office did not respond, but earlier they predicted this measure could save the state $200 million. The decisions over how to spend your tax dollars are in the hands of a few key lawmakers. We'll get a closer look at that process from a state rep who's been there before and is one of the leading voices to come.
It's been a long night.
Both the House and the Senate passed roughly the same size budget, but they pay for drastically different things. Now it falls to a conference committee to turn those differences into a final budget. And joining us now for perspective is State Representative Larry Gonzalez, who serves on the House Appropriations Committee and has been here before as one of the negotiators. Tell me a little bit about just how this process gets started. So you passed a budget in the House, Senate passed a budget in the Senate, and then now what happens?
And then the Senate will ask for conferees, and 5 from each body will get together. For the next several weeks, we are going to go through the budget kind of line by line, making sure that everything adds up. And that's where you start seeing the prioritization of each body on what they choose to fund and at what levels.
And how are the negotiators picked, and who are normally the people chosen?
So I can only speak for the House side. So the House side, it's usually the subcommittee chairs who have been overseeing the process the entire time. I'm not sure how the Senate does their business, but for us, because we're the ones who have led the committees, we're the ones who have led those conversations, and so it's usually going to be us that will go into those conversations with the senators.
And how does the process work? Because there's not a committee room where all the, the 10 people get together and hash this out in public. Tell me about, how the decisions are made.
It's difficult because we're very busy. And starting this week, the House floor will become really busy. So we're going to have full agendas. And so you have to meet kind of when you can. So it's not something that is going to be on some schedule. You find your conferees when you can, because they're also very busy on the Senate side now, too. So you have to just kind of make it work, to be honest with you.
And what's usually the sticking point? I mean, what usually gums up the gears that makes it heated or makes it go smoothly?
Most of it goes pretty smoothly, actually. You're going to have some differences and maybe some numbers and kind of how you appropriate 6 cars versus 10, 10 employees versus 6. Things like that actually get resolved pretty quickly. It's the big issues. It's the public education. It's the foundational school program money that goes in K through 12. It's the method of finance on how you're going to pay for things. It's usually the really big conceptual things is where the budget gets bogged down. The rest of us kind of work through our line items relatively easy, actually.
Let's go through some of those big topics. I guess the first is both chambers have to find $2.5 billion.
Yes.
The House found it by tapping the rainy day fund. The Senate found it by delaying a highway payment that voters constitutionally approved last time. But let's just start with the rainy day fund first. Why tap that? I guess there's always the discussion of when is it raining and how much is it raining. Walk me through that process of how y'all came to that.
Sure. Well, I think it's very important to understand first that the voters of Texas approved the Economic Stabilization Fund to ensure that when times were tough, you had money. So the idea is when times are good, you put money away. When times are tough, you bring money out. That stabilizes our economy so you don't have these drastic cuts. So the state of Texas has kind of always tapped into that. It's always been available, and we've used it many, many times. One of the arguments is that if you use the ESF, Economic Stabilization Fund, that it hurts your bond rating. That is absolutely not correct. It is a piece of what contributes to the bond rating. The comptroller has said this time that 2.5 has 0 effect on bond rating, so put that aside. And actually what you'll hear is, if you don't use money to pay for critical infrastructure, that can hurt your bond rating. It's actually just the opposite. It's if you don't spend it and allow critical infrastructure to go unaddressed, you will get hit on your bond rating, which is something that people don't realize. It actually works in the opposite. So the decision to use a fund that the people of Texas approved for that purpose is actually pretty easy when you start working your way through the amount of money we had available to us. I think it's more open. It is more transparent. It's right there for the world to see. We said we're spending it, and we said what we're going to spend it on. That is different, in my opinion, than the Senate's approach, which is just pushing something off a couple of days. I think we're very honest with the people of Texas on how we're doing that.
Now, when I asked one of your counterparts in the Senate Finance Chair Jane Nelson, I pretty much asked her point blank, is there anything non-negotiable when you go into conference committee? She says everything's negotiable except for using the ESF for ongoing expenses. So are any of these things that you guys are proposing using the rainy day fund for, are they ongoing expenses, or how do you all decide what is an ongoing expense and what is not?
I think for me personally, the idea is we have to get through a certain number of items to get through August, right? So there are programs that need to be addressed, and there are programs that can probably wait or maybe can go to a next fiscal year. But the big picture is, for me, is that when you walk into a negotiation, I think you have to be in a spirit of cooperation. I think you have to be in a spirit of conversation. As you well know, if anybody walks into a room and they're dug in on something, it doesn't go well. So for me, I'm always starting from a point, let's talk about that, right? So that if I know that if there are 10 things that we're going to struggle with, but let's talk about 5 first, right? Chunks of it. So I don't immediately dismiss anything because it just positions you poorly going forward to have a collaborative conversation that I think the people of Texas deserve.
The other big sticking point will be school finance and what we do with school policy in this state, because I talked to Chairman Huberty. He says that $1.6 billion that you all passed and the school finance reform plan are like this. It doesn't happen without the money. Dan Patrick also kind of drew a line in that sand that we're not going to do school finance reform unless there's a school choice measure involved with it. How does that play? Does somebody have to lose, or is there going to be a happy medium here?
The House of Representatives will address school finance. Just because the Supreme Court said we don't have to, does not mean it's not the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do to address K through 12 school finance. So you will see the Texas House step up and address it. We're having that debate on Tuesday, I believe. And you're going to see us, in this budget, not only have we fully funded enrollment growth, this puts even more money into it than that once we look at Chairman Huberty's bill. So we're very committed to that, and we think, I will tell you, the most important thing we do as a state is educate our kids. That's the most important thing we do. You have to have a trained and trainable workforce, otherwise, Phil, you have nothing else. So we've made that commitment, and we're gonna emphasize that commitment on Tuesday. For what the Senate is thinking, can't tell you, but we're committed to school finance.
When you go in there as a negotiator, when someone does draw a line in the sand that say, we're not doing this, or the other side, we are doing this, how does that work out? Is that all talk, or is everything negotiable?
At the end of the day, it will work out, because it has to work out. It is the one thing we have to do each session, is to pass a budget. So at some point, let's call it August, the schools need funding. Right? You can't go in a situation where the public school system in Texas is not operable. So at some point it will come together, because it absolutely has to, because the people of Texas expect it and deserve it, that our schools open on time. So the posturing, how that works, kind of the words that are used, the tone that is used, to me is very important. That's why I start from a very collaborative, cooperative, what can we do? Don't dig in too rough, let's talk about things, is I think the spirit of what you'll see from the House members going into conference committee.
Tough time to come, though.
It is.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks. House lawmakers shut down some of the biggest priorities pushed by Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. So what are the prospects now for controversial items like school choice and the bathroom bill? We'll put the question to our roundtable next on State of Texas. This week, we focus on the ongoing budget battle at the state capitol and the challenge ahead for top negotiators in each chamber. For perspective, we turn to our roundtable, Ross Ramsey from the Texas Tribune and R.G. Ratcliffe from Texas Monthly. Thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, thank you.
So give us an idea, Ross, of how far we are apart from the House and the Senate budget compared to years past.
Well, you know, they always come in here apart, and there are the things where you look at the budgets and you say the numbers are way different, and sometimes those reconcile pretty easily. When the ideas are different, that's when they start having a hard time. And I think this time the real hard one to cross is they disagree on which money to spend. The House is going for its savings account, the rainy day fund. The Senate is instead going to an untested and maybe illegal transfer from general revenue to the state highway fund. So we'll see how they come up with the money. That seems to be their big difference.
RG, well, let's start with the rainy day fund first. How often do they tap the rainy day fund, and how big do they tap it normally?
Well, not very often. Well, they used to tap it almost every session. I mean, it was, in some ways, it was set up to cover expenses when tax revenue did not. And during the times when the budget was was growing quite often, they just used the money, transferred it away. In recent years, Rick Perry kind of made it sanctified. We can't pull the money out of here, and they used what I think $2.5–3 billion in 2011 for education funds, to reduce the amount of education cuts. But it has this just ridiculous kind of idea that there's something sacred about it, and it right now has about $10.5 billion in it. It's going to have about $12 billion in it at the end of this next biennium, and that's really kind of like hoarding tax dollars. And when you think about the size of the whole state budget, you're talking about 10% of all the revenue is just sitting in this fund in cash doing nothing.
And Ross, talk to me about the Senate plan. Someone went to the Attorney General and asked for permission to do this, right?
Right. So voters in November of 2015 approved a thing that said, use some of our sales taxes after we get above a certain amount, use some of our sales taxes for highways, get some cones out there, get some exit ramps built and everything.
Build roads that we need.
So now's when that starts to take effect. And the Texas Senate is saying, well, if we didn't spend it in one fiscal year, if we scooted it one day to the next fiscal year, we could make our budget balance. This is kind of how I paid my landlord when I was in college, right? It's just delay it a day. And,
checks in the mail.
But the problem is that the Constitution says that you have to transfer the money to the highway fund in the same year that you collect the money. So moving it a day to get it into the next budget appears to be unconstitutional. They've asked Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, for a legal opinion on it. I suspect he'll probably go with the Senate on this. But it's a sketchy thing to do, especially when you have the money in your hand in the rainy day fund.
And also the House has also done some budget gimmickry, like particularly on Health and Human Services, where they're setting aside the idea, well, we don't need to spend as much because the feds are going to change block grants and et cetera, et cetera. And they're legally obligated to pay for a lot of the Medicaid funding for people. But it's not unusual that they say, oh, well, not as many people are going to be on Medicaid, or we're not going to spend as much. And and then shove it over into the next biennium where it gets taken care of in a supplemental appropriations bill. And so the House has kind of done that itself this time. It's not quite as hinky as what the Senate's doing, but it's also a budget gimmick.
So there's your takeaways, hinky and sketchy. So.
Right. Is that common to do, though? I mean, like, how often do we kick billions of dollars down into 2 years from now?
They do it a lot, but they always do it after they've expended all the money that they can. So you get a note from the controller at the beginning of the session. It's called the biennial revenue estimate. He says you're going to have this much money come in taxes and fees. So that's your income. Then you look at your savings account. That's the rainy day fund or whatever of it you want to use. And then you start saying, well, maybe we delay this check, maybe we delay this payment, maybe we do this. It's always been after the first two things. This time, as RG said, because that rainy day fund has become kind of sacred, they're going to the accounting tricks before they use the money that they have in hand.
And it's not just the money on some of these issues, it's the policy that comes with the money, like with school finance and school choice or education savings account, vouchers, whatever you call it. Catch us up to what happened this last week at the Texas House. They kind of threw down, a challenge to the Senate, didn't they?
They did. I mean, they voted, I believe it was 103 to 44, in a budget provision to prohibit the controller from spending any money on any kind of program that even remotely resembled a voucher. And so you can pass a bill and create a voucher program, but if there's no money for it, then there's not much there. And so in a lot of ways, Dan Patrick had made that one of his top issues for the session. Governor Abbott was also on the program on that. And by doing that, the House pretty well shut it down. I mean, that's a provision that can be taken out in conference committee, but at the same time, it's not like, that's a pretty good sign that the House is not going to pass the voucher bill. Partly because, I mean, you have even Republicans in rural areas, they don't have very many private schools in rural Texas, and so they don't have any real incentive to take money out of education, the public schools, and put it into private schools.
This kind of goes into a bigger picture question that if one side is saying we're not going to do this or we're absolutely going to do this, how does that play out when they actually negotiate? Is everything on the table, or do drawing lines in the sand actually work?
Well, I mean, you've got to get it through the whole obstacle course to get it through. So if one side or the other just draws a line and says we're not going to go past here, then if they hold the line, then you're not going to go past there. When you're in a budget situation, or when you're in a negotiation in a conference committee where they're reconciling what the House has done and what the Senate has done, each of the conferees, the negotiators, is going to look behind them to see what their members did. And in the case of the vouchers, fewer than half of the Republicans in the House voted for using public money to subsidize private schools. And so if I'm a negotiator from the House, I look at that and say, I don't have the backing to come in here and change our position.
Interesting. And so, RG, talk to us just about, when they come back from Easter weekend, do things change? Is this kind of the fourth quarter, or how intense does the debate get? What should people be watching for?
Oh, well, it is the fourth quarter. I mean, we come in after this break, and it's all the way to the next holiday. Memorial Day. We always end on Memorial Day. And essentially at this point, the game is largely in the House. I mean, the Senate has passed a lot of its controversial legislation. The House, under the Constitution, gets started late. So you're going to start seeing a lot of efforts made to, like, amend the bathroom bill onto other pieces of legislation, or find ways to try and resurrect a direct vote on vouchers. But at this stage, probably the one piece of legislation that's really controversial and alive is sanctuary cities. I think that one's still very much in play. And then the governor wants this convention of the states, which frankly is probably not anything that's going to go anywhere nationally, but it'd be a really easy vote for the House to kick out a bill so that their members, their conservative members, have something they can take back to their constituents who are angry over the bathroom bill not passing or something like that.
Right.
Well, Ross, RG, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you again for joining us for State of Texas. Stay tuned for Meet the Press coming up at 9. Have a great day.